Hello, how are you, Alice?
Oh, pretty good. Thank you. Okay, I think I started the recording, so we should be good to go. And yeah, I know there was I will also try and upload the last video up to YouTube. I think we just have one missing there. So after today's session, I'll get both of those updated. So yeah, thanks everyone for joining. If you haven't been here before, which I think, we have started to have a good group on here. I think most of you have. This is the AKS Public Office Hours. It's hosted by the Cloud Native Global Black Belt team or the Digital and App Innovation Global Black Belt team, whatever number you prefer. And yeah, I'll go through a few updates today, and then we have a special presentation from Michael around the AKS Security Product Group features. And usually Dave is the one hosting these guys, but he needed some help, so I'm helping out. My name is Alice Gibbons. I am also on Dave's team. Yeah, the Global Black Belt team. I live in Canada. This is Ray. We also have another colleague, Ray, who is also helping out. That is his GitHub, not mine. But we all kind of do the same stuff. We like to promote and evangelize, Kubernetes and Azure, as well as we get to work with a lot of cool customers across the Americas on that. So yeah, happy to be here. I have not written a book like Dave, so I will not try and peddle you my book. But yeah, feel free to post any questions in the chat. And yeah, if you haven't been here before, why do we do these? These are generally to provide AKS customers with updates pertaining to AKS and the cloud native ecosystem, and essentially to host a short talk or demo on the cloud native technologies that we have, related to the Kubernetes ecosystem and AKS in general. So we've been, partnering with the product group for a while now as well, which has been awesome, in order to get some of those features out and get, questions answered, because it actually saves us on the Global Black Belt team from answering a lot of these questions as well. So it's beneficial for all parties. And yeah, we also always want to collect feedback from customers on blockers, use cases, etc. So today I'm just going to do a quick overview on some of the AKS updates that came out in the release notes, and then hand it over to Michael. But yeah, keep in mind, post questions in the chat. Feel free to come off mute and ask me anything, and ask Michael anything. I also have one of my colleagues, Diego, here with me, and he can help me field the chat, which is awesome. Okay, let's get into it. So we had a new release for AKS. This was, I believe this just came out this past week. It is some of the announcements that came along with that. Containerd will be the default runtime for Windows node pools. This is a big deal. It was in preview before, so you could choose whether you wanted Containerd or the Docker shim. And Docker will be deprecated in Windows starting in 1.24. So this is more of a Windows announcement, but I know that's been a feature that a lot of people have been asking for, just for features around lower latency, things like that. Starting with 124, the default format of the cluster user credential for AD will be exec. So this, if you haven't played with the Cube login plugin or binary before, that's something you should probably look into. And essentially it allows you to authenticate through the Azure CLI in a non-interactive way. So there's not really a behavior change for if you're not using AAD clusters, or actually AAD clusters that are older than 1.24. But if you're behind the gun with 1.24, that's something you want to check out. The connectivity rollout, this was a common question we got from a lot of customers. We were moving this, yeah, it's been going on for a while. We were moving away from OpenVPN to connectivity, which is essentially the pod that or the pods that are connecting the control plane to the cluster. And essentially it started last year, I think. Maybe Michael can correct me on the exact date when it started. And we did some rollout, and then we had to pull it back because there were some changes that needed to be made. And I think we're doing it again, or we are doing it again for sure. And it's continuing right now, and it'll hopefully be done by the end of May. So this is great for lots of reasons. We've been trying to get rid of that OpenVPN dependency for a while, and it'll finally be happening. And last but not least, updating the AKS labels to the recommended substitutions before the deprecation of 1.24. That's just, yeah, this is an upstream thing. If you look at the 1.24 release, you can see how to update your labels on the link there. And I can post this link in the chat. In terms of any other release note updates, the few things I want to call out here. The one feature that's awesome, it's a new preview feature we've been actually getting a lot of asks for. So in etcd, AKS now supports enabling encryption at rest for your data, and you can use the aka.ms plugin. So that essentially allows you to, use a key and bring your own key within Key Vault for etcd encryption. That's a requirement we get from lots of enterprise customers who, want to bring their own keys because they have these, these set of gold standard keys that they have within their enterprise. So that's an exciting announcement, and that's in preview right now. Couple bug fixes went out. Probably won't go into those too deeply. The one I did want to call out was the one I highlighted in bold here. So there has been a behavior change. This caught up on a few customers, but essentially the way that we are applying taints and labels is not modifiable from the Kubernetes API anymore if you applied it through the AKS or the Azure CLI. So what I mean by that is if you are how it used to be is if you added a taint or a label through the CLI, like the Azure CLI, just with AZ, AKS something, you would be able to take that off just using kubectl commands. Now you have to take it off using AZ, AKS commands, so the Azure CLI. And so this might not seem like that big of a deal, but it has caught up a few customers just in if they had taints that needed to be on those node pools initially, and they were trying to take them off just using regular kubectl commands. That won't work anymore. AKS is going to try and keep those on if you have applied those on through, the initial deployment process. And I see someone has their hand up. Is this a question on the taints, or was this just a general question?
Well, the chat doesn't seem to be enabled. That's all I wanted to notify you guys.
I can see the chat. Are there other people having that issue? I posted it. I said hello. We'll start in 2 minutes.
No, it actually says chat is only available during the meeting.
Oh, weird, because Richard and I can talk to each other.
Okay, I can see it now. Thank you.
Okay, very strange. Thank you for calling that out. Yeah. Teams, loves to do fun things on us. So yeah, that was the main thing I wanted to call out on these release notes. Again, that behavioral change for the taints and labels, just something to look into. There's not a doc on it per se, but just if you read our taints documentation, it was essentially looked at as a bug fix from the way that we had taints applied in the old version. And then, yeah, there was a few component updates. I'm not going to go into those in detail, but yeah, we bumped CSI drivers, disk and file, things like that. Any questions on that? And if you can't use the chat, just feel free to come off mute. I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, I'm curious about the Nginx ingress controller images statement.
Nginx ingress controller images statement. The one.
The third bullet point after component updates.
Oh, okay. That was just yeah. Okay, so we bumped the.
Yeah,
you guys
so
actually support Nginx?
only in the HTTP add-on. So it depends on what you're using. So if you're just using AKS normally, then this doesn't apply to you. I put a note in the GitHub page for these CVEs. But if you're using the HTTP add-on, then this CVEs will apply to you.
Gotcha. Thanks.
Good question. I missed that. Yeah, and then I see that there's a question in the chat here. How does this affect exact thingy affect this change? That doesn't. It's just for kube login. So from my understanding, Michael, correct me if I'm wrong.
That's
here.
correct. It's only for it's only when you do your logon. That's correct.
Okay. Yeah. So if you're doing a non-interactive login through Azure DevOps or GitHub Actions or something like that, then that's when you'd use the kube login plugin. It wouldn't if you're just heading in with the regular AZ AKS get credentials. That's just going to be normal. The -- admin flag. I think that's either, depending on what you're using, what version you're using, that's either you can have that deprecated or not. There's an option in that for AKS to do that because it kind of reroutes you around some of the guardrails we put in place with AAD.
Yeah, so just to provide a little bit more color, it's not going to change anything with AZ AKS get credentials. It's when you run your kubectl that change is going to take effect.
Good questions, though. And yeah, if there's no more on the updates, I will post some of the links in the chat here, and I'll actually hand it over to you, Michael, if that's cool.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Awesome.
All right. See how quick. Okay. Hopefully everybody can see my screen now.
Yeah, we do.
So thanks. Okay, good. Thanks, Kendall, for everybody setting this up. I actually wanted to set this up because obviously I get a lot of questions on what's the roadmap for security. It's a complex topic, so I just wanted to use this time to make sure we get everybody on the same page with where we're going and what's coming up from a capabilities point of view. And if it would fast forward, okay. So starting with this slide, the idea that we're going from a capabilities point of view is to bring end-to-end security to AKS. So that starts from the build side, through the registry side, through the cluster, through the node, and through the application. So full end-to-end basic capabilities. So as you look at it, if you look at this picture, this actually represents, a prototypical AKS cluster. You've got your build pipeline injecting capability images in. You've got your control plane. You've got a bunch of namespaces. You've got applications deployed in there talking to external resources using Active Directory or Key Vault or whatever it might be. So when you look at it, obviously there's multiple attack vectors that exist across this ecosystem. Right. So on the build side, we're essentially talking about static analysis, making sure that essentially what the developers are building is secure. Right. So think DevSecOps, shifting left, whatever those buzzwords are. But really behind the scenes, what we're talking about is implementing static analysis capabilities. I'll talk a little bit more about how we actually bring that to bear. When you look at the registry, obviously with our ACR capabilities, we're obviously looking at static analysis capabilities there. So making sure nobody's dropping images in that have vulnerabilities. But more importantly than that, we want to really make sure that there's nobody pushing or pulling images from the registry that have serious vulnerabilities in them as well. And then there's this thing about code integrity, right? So image signing that we're working on with Notary V2. There's been a little bit of buzz about that on the call as well. That kind of brings this home to make sure that what you're building is actually what's deployed from an integrity perspective. That is accounted for there. That's one of the big attack vectors that exists. Someone spoofing a tag as an example, and then trying to get that into the pipeline using a Trojan horse or whatever it might be. On the cluster side, there's a lot of things we're doing for API level security. Alice just loaded to the Scd Security that we just enabled. So if you are putting secrets in your Scd, by default, Scd is not necessarily an attack vector, but as soon as you dump your secrets in there, now you've introduced that as an attack vector, and at least you can do a BYOK to protect that Scd environment. Obviously, the API server is the big attack vector. So if you can access the API server, you can access everything in the cluster. So making sure that the API server, obviously from our perspective, it's black boxed, but the assurances that you have that that's secure is from a security posture perspective. And then down below, you obviously have the nodes, which are holding your applications, and they obviously are interfacing with your API service as well. You have that kubectl down there, the kubelet down there as an example. So maybe you try to attack from the API server. If you can attack the API server because you got cluster admin, now you can see everything. Maybe if I'm running as root on the node, I can now attack up, and I can start to attack east and west as well from a node level perspective. And then obviously the applications sitting up top, making sure that they're not vulnerable, making sure that they're compliant, and making sure that there's no runtime infractions on them are going to be really important in order to bring this end-to-end security capability to bear. So when we look at it holistically, we're talking about combining in Microsoft Defender for containers. Think of that as really providing that end-to-end lens that I was talking about. So now with the CI/CD scope that's there, if you have customers that are building out through Azure DevOps or GitHub Actions, now you can start to do static analysis on that capabilities. That's very Linux centric, but Windows is coming to there as well. And I'll kind of bear out the roadmap here in the next couple of slides. Policy, think of that as really the enforcement engine. There's some key capabilities that we're adding into Azure Policy, so that think of that as you look at that flow that I had in the previous slide, is you want to basically have, as someone's building an image and moving that through the pipeline, not only assessing that state, looking for drift off of that state, but using policy to restrict the evolution of that image if that state changes. Okay, so that's going to be another important piece of the evolution that we're bringing in. I'll talk about a couple of different features that we're lighting up that'll make this happen. Obviously, ACR, Azure Key Vault are going to be important. Then, of course, the Azure Kubernetes service. So really, when you look at the entirety of the Azure portfolio, it's bringing these services to bear to bring in a true end-to-end container cloud native security story. Okay, so we are looking at not only what AWS and Google are doing, we're looking at what third party is. So the charter that I'm leading is to basically build a native security story that is market leading. So that's not only against our competitors, but that's against third party as well. And so we're talking about on the build side, building in assessing and restriction capabilities around vulnerability and compliance. On the registry, assessing, preventing drift based off of the vulnerability, compliance, and the signature capabilities. On the cluster side, preventing bad deployments based off of the vulnerability state, someone trying to deploy a container running as root, or someone spoofs a signature and then tries to deploy that from a rogue registry as an example. So we're going to be able to enforce that as well. And then assessing and preventing drift of the cluster itself. So you look at the different cluster versions, containerd, all that stuff like that, making sure that stays up to date as well. And then, as I alluded to before, actually preventing attacks from the control plane is going to be a big one. So if someone does, get in the API server, it's a shared model, and then uses that to attack you, there's multiple protections we have in place, but that's always evolving, always being plussed up. On the node side, making sure that the nodes stay compliant, stay vulnerable, and to prevent south to north, east to west based attacks. And then on the application side, looking at the vulnerability state, the compliance state, and bringing in runtime-based protections is really what we're doing holistically to bring this capability to bear. And I'll say, as I'm going in, as I get into the next slide, now I'm getting down in the different features that we're delivering across each of the pillars, which are kind of closing these attack vectors, so to speak, as I was alluding to. With the time, if I have time, I want to go through and answer your questions directly. But I would say, as I'm going through, just come off mute and ask me the question directly. So go ahead. I heard one coming.
I have a quick question on the process runtime monitoring for Linux. Is this similar to how intercepting syscalls, like how sysdic does, or are we talking about something different here?
So I can allude to some of the things, but it would be close to that. So think of like eBPF based capabilities. So it's actually kernel level assessment. So it's not like, if you're familiar with like the Azure Defender for Kubernetes that existed before, that was actually looking at logs after an attack actually happened. So what we've actually done is refactor that to now actually sit down at the kernel level. So it's actually doing process call level transaction evaluation, right? So much more in line with the industry standard as an example, and market leading in that front.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. All right. So this is what we actually delivered last semester. So if you follow our AKS roadmap, obviously in these office hours, a lot of this stuff was talked about. But the big thing is obviously shifting left, we introduced the CI/CD capability that I alluded to earlier. We've also public previewed on the open source side actual signing capabilities. So we do now have a fully functioning end-to-end signing and verification process from build to red cluster. So you build the image, sign the image, and then AKS will verify the image on deployment. There's some work we're doing in the policy side, which will light that up, and then we'll announce an actual official public preview on the AKS side. But at the very least, we have an end-to-end solution that will unblock a lot of customers on this specific ask. On the cluster side, there's a lot of things we're doing. Like we finally finalized our authentication and authorization story. That essentially means that with AAD enablement, which is the best practice, is highly recommended that you AAD enable the cluster for your authentication. Then you can leverage conditional access or JIT access policies. So you're not baking in cluster admin that have full-time access to the cluster. You're giving them just-in-time access to do whatever it is they need to do. And then leveraging a role-based access control to give them a least privilege model within the constraints for what they want to do within the cluster as well, on top of that JIT-based access. And then with all of that, and just as alluded to in one of the chats, you do an AZ AKS get credentials -- admin. That is actually bypassing that authentication and authorization structure. And then now you're getting credentials of the cluster admin on the cluster. Okay, so now we give the ability to disable that transaction, so that user has to go through whatever authentication and authorization you've set for that user base. And there is no way for them to go and grab the cluster admin bypassing that least privileged access model that you built for them. HTTPS proxy. So there's work we've done about getting the proxy out, so that if you want to front end your cluster, have all the inbound and outbound traffic through the proxy, you can do that. We also gave a way to manage the secrets externally in Key Vault. For a operational construct, we've also changed the way we do certificate rotation. We used to have a manual cert rotation with a short-lived certificate, as everybody's alluded to, that 2-year window. And we had a lot of customers open up a lot of support issues around those certificates expiring, breaking their clusters. So now we did some underpinning with TLS bootstrapping as an example to now turn on auto cert rotation. And so that will, from an operational perspective, makes certificate managed within the cluster a lot easier. I've also been working on attestation around the CIS state from top to bottom for the cluster. So last semester, I published the CIS for Kubernetes documentation that publishes the state of the attestation of the state of the cluster from a compliance perspective. I think I've told quite a few people, but just to reiterate, on the first cut of this, because this is going to be a living state that we're going to be working through, we failed 11 on our first cut. I think if you look at our competitors without calling anybody out, they failed many more than that, right? As an example, they're probably fixing theirs as well, but I have work items in this semester to fix 6 of them. So at the end state, of those 11, the reason I left the 11 at fail because we're doing some investigation. So most likely what will happen is 5 of them will move from fail to operational risk, and then 6 of them will move to pass, as an example. And then there's a bunch of work we've done on the AKS built-in policies. Hopefully you're starting to see an improved experience around the AKS built-in policies. When I inherited them and started working on them, there was a lot of issues, I guess, with the policies. We had a lot of support cases came up around them. Now we have dedicated engineering cycles around that. So we've been spending a lot of time is refining the experience around those built-in policies. Notice there was nothing we did on the node side. I'll talk about that in the next slide as we're going through. On the application side, as I alluded to with that earlier question, one of the big things that we did is we re-architected from the ground up how we did runtime-based security. Instead of doing log analytics after the fact, which was a VM-based model, now we're actually doing a kernel-based model. So think Project Falco in that regard from a Ebpf perspective. So now we have the defender, which actually lays down a privileged daemon set across the cluster, and that obviously gives the plumbing for you to now, that defender pod, to now talk down to the kernel. So the idea is that from a capabilities point of view, as attacks happen, they're actually, if you know the flow from the top to the bottom, kernel to daemon to pod, as an example, so anything inbound and outbound is going to be traversing through that kernel. So really, it's about dropping capabilities into the kernel and sensing transactions inbound and outbound. And so from an inbound perspective, you're now hitting and restricting that transaction before it ever actually hits the pod. So it's actually preventative-based runtime protection once we get all these capabilities built out. Once we had that defender daemon set laid down, now we use that to also introduce for the first time continual vulnerability scanning on your pods. It's a little bit of a nuance because it's actually looking at the images that sit in ACR because that's where the scanning logic sits today. But that's why I'm going to talk about the next capability, which is going to move that topology as we're kind of going through. But at the very least, now you're starting to get insight through the Microsoft Defender for Container SKU around the vulnerability state of your running applications, which is something that didn't happen before. You had to go third party to do that. And now that we have that capability, the first sensor we lit up is the process sensor. So that's in public preview today. We're still adding a series of capabilities to that. So think malware detection, secrets detection, PID rollover based detection as an example. And then we're working towards GAing that feature set very, very soon. Any questions on last semester? All right. So now this is the current semester we're in right now. You can see there's a whole host of capabilities that we're in the process of delivering as we speak. That I'll kind of talk through. I talked about vulnerability scanning on Linux. Windows is coming. That's essentially going to be a next semester thing that I can kind of talk through. We are working on the public preview of Notary V2 on AKS, and we're also working on quarantine capabilities. So that's essentially taking advantage of the static analysis that exists within the registry and building push and pull Azure policies to restrict what can be pushed based off of its vulnerability state and what can be pulled based off of its vulnerability state as well. And then if anybody wasn't paying attention, we now have vulnerability assessment of Windows in ACR as well. So as customers are putting their Go-based or Node-based images in ACR or their .NET-based, ACR will output a static analysis of that image. On the cluster side, obviously I alluded to the Kubernetes-based Cis Compliance. I just published last week, maybe a week and a half ago now, the Ubuntu state as well. Once again, that's a living document. We have quite a few fails that exist there, but we're constantly going and refining and tweaking that, eventually hoping to get to a state of full compliance. But at the very least, we had a lot of debates about, do I publish about where we're at, or do I wait till we've completely remediated everything? And I wanted to at least give an attestation to the customer base with the guarantee that we are remediating as it's going on. So that document will constantly be tweaked as we're fixing items to move them from fail over to an operational risk or to a pass, as an example. So that document just shipped, and then so we still have, you'll see other work items down below which are tagged as CIS that we're starting to work back on what we deemed as a fail before. And then we're starting the work now finally on the CIS for Windows. So hopefully by the end of the semester, or hopefully a little bit before the end of the semester, I'll have that document published as well. On the workload identity front, everybody's aware of pod identity. We're working towards the deprecation of that in replacement for workload identity. We just kicked off the private preview yesterday of workload identity with managed identity. So we're working through that as well. And then now that we have app registration and managed identity working with workload identity, now we're using the feedback from our current customer base to now move that to public preview by the end of the semester, with the inevitability of GAing that and then out pod identity. Alice talked about KMS. So if you do want to put the secrets in the cluster in etcd, now you can at least secure them. CIS. So one of the CIS findings was disabling SSH. We've had a lot of customers asking for this. So now we're going to light up the capability through a parameter for allow customers to actually just turn off the SSH service if they choose. And so there's actually going to be a 3-phase feature set that we're going to do. One is to allow customers the ability to disable the SSH service. Obviously, there'll be a break glass so they can enable that back. There's going to be an update SSH. So if you want to use SSH, at least you can roll through and update the SSH key is another feature that we're doing. And we're also going to be lighting up AAD enabled SSH. So if you do want to use SSH, it's not going to be using the local account. It's going to be using AAD managed account for access to SSH, where you can apply all your role-based access control to that account. So those are 3 phases that we're kind of working through, but a lot of customers for their production clusters, in order to maintain compliance, have to turn off SSH, and this is going to allow them to meet that level of compliance. Alice, let me know how I'm doing on time. For Eraser, if you haven't heard about this, essentially what this is cleaning up of images based off of vulnerability data. Okay, and so the idea here is that everybody's got a pipeline to basically promote images up into their nodes, into their cluster. And what happens over time is you start to get image bloat, right? And so nobody really has a pipeline to tear away those images. And so what Eraser will do is look at the images and will output a list of images. Right now, it's not working against the vulnerability state. We're literally just doing, hey, look, what images are on the node, remove everything that's attached to a running pod and output that list to the customer so you can actually delete them out. What we will be adding in very soon as well is the ability for that eraser to basically also publish out the vulnerability state of all those images that are sitting stagnant on the node. Adding in external identity provider. As I alluded to, you can either do a local cluster or an AAD enabled cluster. We're also going to be lighting up through Workload Identity. We're bringing in OIDC issuer. We're just going to take it the rest of the way and add in all the OIDC federation capabilities. So you can do, if you want to do ping federate or Okta or whatever it might be from an identity perspective, yes, you can do that. So this helps light up multi-cloud based scenarios. Instance metadata is a big one. We're working through giving customers the ability to restrict the instance metadata. As you're probably aware, I published this out on our concepts document. If you have an unprivileged pod, that unprivileged pod has access to the instance metadata endpoint. If you can create that, you can get a manifest and see actually all the managed identities, the certificates that are sitting off of that endpoint. And then now you have a managed identity with contributor access or owner access. You can start to expand your attack vector from there. And then obviously through that, now I can move from just a unprivileged pod talking over to a managed identity with some credentials and start to do some other things. So at the very least, what we're looking to do is provide the ability, once again through a feature, for customers to restrict unprivileged pods from talking to IMDS. So if you want to talk to IMDS, you just do host network equals true, a la a privileged pod, and you would get that access. There's other things we're doing on top of that, which if I have time, I'll be able to talk through that as well. Rolling through the metric server, which was another fail on the CIS side, and then local auth refinement. This is essentially going through, if you are doing local auth --admin, right now that that cluster admin, that cluster user are coming with a certificate, a long-lived certificate. So what we're looking to do is replace that long-lived certificate with a short-lived token. So if it is compromised, they don't have, and somebody left, you know, because right now the fix is, if say you've done your --admin, you've pulled that certificate's going to live for 2 years or until, so say someone leaves, well, they've still got that certificate. But then you got to bump the CA, which is a very obtrusive action, in order to revoke that certificate. Where if you had a short-lived token, that attack vector only exists for so long. Air gap AKS. Go ahead. No, it's okay.
There's a few questions, and I just want to make sure we don't lose them.
Go ahead.
Richard's doing a really great job in the chat of answering some of them, but I just want to call out a few ones. Yeah, thank you, Richard. So Richard had a good question on like, when will workload identity get managed identity support? I think you touched on workload identity, you might have missed it, but if you just want to cover that quick.
Yeah, so let me hit it. Okay, so what we're tentative is we are working directly with the identity team. We are waiting on the identity team, not to call anybody else out, but we are waiting on the identity team to move managed identity with federated identity to public preview and to GA. The dates that they have communicated is 9/30 for public preview and 12/30 for GA. So our timelines will be married to their timeline. So when they public preview, we will public preview on the AKS, because I do not want to public preview this feature without managed identity. We have it working end to end with app registration, but I wanted to wait for the managed identity support before we moved it to public preview. So we are tentatively looking at 9/30 for public preview and 12/30 for GA. I am working very hard to try to accelerate those timelines, but that's where we're at right now.
Cool. And then there was a follow-up question on that, on the upgrade or migration path to Workload Identity, which I think we have covered on this call before, but just for everyone that hasn't heard it before.
The upgrade path for what?
For Workload Identity.
Great question. So there's going to be a couple of transition paths that exist. So obviously we are going to allow for customers to deploy pod identity and workload identity together on the cluster. Okay. So depending on, really it comes down to what the application identity structure is. Are they using ADOL? Are they using MSOL as an example? So that's one of the things that I'm flushing out. So right now I've built out an end-to-end implementation documentation for customers to use. Tomorrow morning, I'm actually starting on a transition document, which will cover essentially application identity conversion. So if you're using ADOL today on pod identity, how do you go to MSOL on workload identity? So there will be a transition doc for that. And then, but maybe you're using MSOL today, what's the conversion look like as well going over to workload identity? That I'm in the process of actually flushing out and will be publishing out to customers very soon as well. But it shouldn't be too big of a hill. The biggest hurdle is going from ADOL to MSOL, right?
And that'll be,
as long as,
sorry.
No, go ahead.
That'll be hosted on a blog, or are you posting that on the AKS notes, or what? This is.
That's right. I'm gonna basically, I'll probably do a GitHub post. I'll put it on the release notes, but the at the very least, this will live in our AKS docs once this goes to public preview as well.
Awesome. Okay, that's thanks for covering that. And then I think the last one that I thought was interesting in the chat here, and like feel free everyone as I'm going through and hitting these to Michael, if I don't hit your question, make sure to repost it. This one was interesting because I've heard this from a customer too. So it seems that the secret story is mainly about using CSI secret store with Azure Key Vault. However, it currently does not support syncing secrets without them being mounted on the pod first. This is a crucial missing use case that often means using another tool. Is there any plans to fill this gap?
Yes, there's already a work item to address that. That's going to be coming in our next release.
Okay, cool. I wonder, I can maybe look at that. Is it in, oh, I can look for that on the roadmap.
Yeah, I can sync with you offline because that's eventually going to be, that's not on our roadmap yet, but that's something I'm working on. Yep.
Okay, cool. And what is the advantage of putting secrets in etcd versus Key Vault?
I'd say it's the other way. I actually try to strongly encourage customers not to put it in etcd because, as I said before, etcd by default is not technically an attack vector because you're really just holding basic configs in there. But as soon as you put the secrets in there, now you've added in, you've made the etcd attack more valuable, right? But if I externalize them in a vault, now I've segmented out my security. So I think by using CSI Secret Store, it's more secure at the end of the day. But I understand the ask why customers want to use KMS. Putting the secrets in the cluster is more fluid from a DevOps perspective. So that's why it makes more sense. So it really depends on the use case. Now what we have, and I actually have to build a concept stock for this because now I'm starting to get a lot of questions, which I knew, why should I use KMS or CSI Secret Store, and what's the value prop?
Yeah, that's a good point. That would be like a good doc, I think, to have. I think we're gonna get that more. Okay, cool. And then I think last one before we keep going. Yeah, there is a private preview right now for managed identity, workload identity, isn't there?
There is. I just kicked it off yesterday.
Okay.
So the hard part about that is because everybody seems to be using pod identity, everybody's waiting for this. I got hammered on requests for this, so we capped it at 15, and I got the 15 in about 30 minutes. So so we're pretty much at capacity. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, cool. Okay, I think that was most of it. Thanks for answering that. That was great.
Felt like a rock star when everybody started hitting me up.
Feels good, right? Yeah.
All right. So any questions I did not answer, and how am I doing on time? I got about 5 minutes, right? Or am I probably already over?
No, you're 9.3. You're like, we're good. We're good to just, open it up to questions. But yeah, continue on with what you're doing. And then, yeah, we can do open Q&A at the end.
Okay, so there's
I got a quick question on the AKS Key Vaults thing. Is there a private preview for that as well?
for the AKS Key Vault.
Yes, like AKS and Key Vault being in synchronization without CSI mount.
Yes, so that's in preview, and that's essentially the big thing that we're working on is trying to make that integration cleaner. Yep.
Okay, how do we register for that preview if it is still in private?
That's a good point because that's actually led by the Key Vault team, and what they're bringing is auto rotation, and that's the key thing that you were waiting on, right? And so let me circle back to Alice. If you make a note, I can circle back on that one.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I made a note of that.
All right, so keeping going on, I'll just hit a couple of different data points that'll kind of, so air-gapped AKS, if you haven't heard about this, as you're aware, so even with a public or private cluster, there's still certain egress requirements. So we are categorically going through and eliminating out those egress requirements so you can have a fully air-gapped, non-firewall in front need based AKS cluster, right? So you heard about the connectivity rollout with 443, standardizing the port topology, going through. So right now we have ACR or MCR, I should say, and AAD. So if you're doing a local cluster, the only thing you have to worry about is MCR. We are working on what's called ACR projection, which essentially projects an ACR into the VNet and then syncs MCR and ACR. So essentially the images are now basically pulled from inside the customer VNet, and then all we have to do is flip a bit on the AKS nodes, so tell them not to go out to public MCR, just go to local ACR. And so that there, and then if you're in AAD, we're working on some private-based networking on the AAD side to eliminate out those air-gapped-based requirements. Node authorization is a big one. This is essentially just enabling the node restriction and mission controller on the cluster. So if someone does compromise the node, they do get to kubectl. This at least limits out what access kubectl has. And this really is about centric capabilities. So if you do with node authorization, if someone does be able to attack the node, they can only attack the node. They can't use that node to do east and west transactions. And so that's essentially what node authorization will bring, is prevent the ability for, if someone does compromise the node, they can only compromise that node, at least through kubectl and kubelet. Another big one I was talking about before, and I alluded to this in quite a few different points, we are adding in the external data source capability in Azure Policy. If you're following the Gatekeeper and OPA release capabilities, for Eraser, that was the core use case that we were working through. We've added in external data source capabilities to Gatekeeper, and now we're forking that into Azure Policy. So that builds the ability for a policy. So think of a policy sitting at build, sitting between the registry and the cluster, sitting in front of the applications, right? So now that policy can now query something else for state. So as I alluded to before, the vulnerability state for images actually sits in ACR. So that's the reason why, even though Microsoft Defender is scanning the pods, it's actually going back to ACR to see the state. Well, with external data source, we can set a policy, and now essentially the policy will query, but the data actually lives where it's supposed to be. So this also goes true for Notary v2. This will help light that up. And so now we can build a policy that sits on the cluster that says, hey, look, go and query ACR for the signature. And then, yes, I'm going to line that signature up for what I'm deployed. And yes, that signature lines up. I'm going to allow that deployment to actually happen. So the external data source capability will light up the full end-to-end based scenario. So we can do vulnerability compliance enforcement, signature enforcement, and this will also light up the runtime-based capability. So think of blocking a DDoS attack on a application transactions, or blocking a specific process transaction or storage transaction on a specific pod. That's what this capability starts to light up. And so now that we have that, we're in the final stages of developing that. We're going to be building AKS built-in policies which leverage that capability and start to stack them in across the end-to-end. So that's a really, really big feature for us. On the node side, we are now moving into the confidential space. I'm going to very soon be publishing a concepts guide for confidentiality within AKS. So if you have data sovereignty requirements, if you have confidential requirements, we're bringing in the entire confidential stack within AKS. So trusted VM at the boot level, confidential VM, from a capability point of view, and the inevitability will be we'll also introduce in the next semester confidential pod as well. And so that'll be a net new capability. If you haven't heard about that, that we're bringing in. So that's basically code integrity from the host all the way up to the pod, between the processor and the kernel, through the hypervisor, all the way up through the stack. So it's going to be a very, very secure configuration that we're bringing in, and that will be a net new SKU that's coming to AKS. Obviously, dedicated host is out, bringing Kubernetes specific runtime to the node. So everybody's familiar with Microsoft Defender for servers. That's a very VM centric capability. What we're doing is extracting out TVM and FIM, which is the runtime and malware and identity file integrity capabilities that exist in server, and dumping them into Microsoft Defender for containers. So the idea is that we're sucking all the capabilities out of Microsoft Defender for server and importing them into Microsoft Defender for containers. So if you're trying to secure your container ecosystem from end to end, you don't have to subscribe to multiple SKUs. You just subscribe to one SKU and you get all the bells and whistles. I alluded to that we're doing profile-based detection. So we're also looking at, we're going to be using that to build a profile. So think whitelist, blacklist based behaviors. And so that's essentially the big thing that we're doing. And then we're going to start looking at building this capability on the Windows side. Any other questions?
Yeah, Michael, there's a few in the chat. I just was waiting to see if you're done. So in terms of, a few things going on here. One question was good. Can you upgrade or modify an existing AKS cluster to air-gapped, or does it require redeployment?
Nope, this is just egress requirements. So what we're doing is eliminating egress requirements. So there'll be no change on the cluster side. It's just what firewall rules you have to apply to that cluster to allow it to talk out.
Okay, so, yes,
so the firewall rules will just keep going away. That's the idea.
Okay, so that's a good one. Oh yeah, then I don't know. I missed this too. Did you say that process monitoring, Defender process monitoring is GA already?
It's in public preview, and we're working to move it to GA in the next couple of months. You should see an announcement in the next month or two about that moving to GA.
Gotcha. And then, there's lots of comments that this is a lot of features, and I was thinking that myself. I was like, wow, you guys are busy. Busy team. And then any software bill of materials plans for Defender scanners?
So yes, so the short answer is yes. So that comes down to the static analysis capabilities. But the short answer is yes, SBOM based detection is essentially what we're going through. So think of the idea as basically interrogating an actual file, looking at the manifest, and then basically doing the intelligence from there. Right. So that's the key capability we're getting at. There's some features we have to add. So we're not there yet, but that is coming.
Yeah, that's like the overarching goal. Okay.
Yep.
Awesome.
Yep. That's the North Star.
And then, yeah, okay. Does AKS Defender depend on Azure Security Center or Sentinel? So the Security Center is the old name for Defender.
Yeah, so that's the good news is all those dependencies been moved. So think of like log analytics and all that stuff like that before is essentially built in-house now, right? So there's our own security research team.
Oh, Michael, you cut out a little bit there. Maybe that's just for me.
That exists within Microsoft Defender. There's actually ethical hackers that live in-house, right? That's the key thing. And so by deploying the Microsoft Defender for Container SKU, not only are you getting all the base protections, but there's think of like their own researchers that are sitting up there looking at different attack vectors. So as different attacks, or as the attack space is evolving, we are dynamically updating the protections based off or through that specific SKU.
Okay, and I think you cut out there a little bit in the middle, but we got some of the gist of it, I think.
Oh,
Not sure.
yes. Sorry, I guess.
Okay, yeah, I think
I'm trying not to move. I didn't know if it was my head. Can you hear me now?
kind of, it's like a little bit in and out, at least for me.
Okay, regarding.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's probably my network, so I apologize. So hopefully everybody can pick me up.
Okay.
Yes, but so there's a question around Falco and Ebpf, right? So yes, we're doing a lot of work with Ebpf. So think of like process level detection, network level detection, storage detection, and syscall-based detection. And then yes, there's different things that we could possibly do with control plane and stuff like that. This is constantly evolving from a capability point of view. Yep. So the idea is that all you should do if you want to provide these end-to-end capabilities that I'm showing on this screen, deploy Microsoft Defender for container. That's the idea.
Okay, cool. Good questions. I think that was awesome. I feel like Defender for containers. Yeah, so that's the confusing thing, at least I've found for customers too, Richard, is that like people, like we still don't have that name fully locked down, right? Everyone still thinks of it as Security Center, but it's all been changed to Defender for X across like entire Azure. So, there.
Yeah, now it's Microsoft Defender for server, Microsoft Defender for containers, Microsoft Defender for endpoint, for web app, whatever it might be. Yep.
Totally. Cool, that was great. Thank you so much, Michael. I don't know if there's any other questions. We have like 5 minutes left here, but I think we covered a lot today. Defender, yeah. That's next.
That's funny.
Yeah. But yeah, I guess you can still feed it into Sentinel. If you're using Sentinel, you can still feed Defender into Sentinel.
Absolutely. You
Yeah.
can kick it out to Splunk if you wanted to. Yeah, it doesn't matter. But think of that as like the repository of information. What you do with that is going to be the next evolution. Yep.
Good point. But yeah, thanks everyone for all your great questions. If you have any ones that I missed in the chat or anything else for Michael, now is your chance. Otherwise, I can give you 4 minutes back into your day.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. That was really rapid fire. It's impressive how quickly you can talk.
And I was trying to actually talk slow so I could get through everything, but so much content, you have to move fast.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thanks everyone. And again, I'll try and get this uploaded to YouTube as soon as possible. Sorry on the delay there. And yeah, next time we have our friends from Calico and Tiger coming on talking about the CNI None feature, and they also have a blog post that's coming out as well. So that's in like 2 weeks. So I will we'll talk about that one coming up here. But yeah, thanks everyone for joining, and have a good rest of your day.
Absolutely. Everybody have a great one.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Michael.
All right. Cheers.